When she first brought up the idea of joining the gym, I felt genuinely happy for her. She walked through the door that day with an excited smile, the kind I hadn't seen on her face in a long time. She talked about how everyone at work was getting into fitness, and it felt like her turn to join in. At first, I didn't think much of it. It sounded like something she'd been wanting to do for a while. She had mentioned getting healthier here and there, and I figured this was finally her taking the plunge. Honestly, I admired her for it. I know how much she values her routines, and making changes isn't exactly her thing, so signing up for a gym membership, that was a big step. But after a few weeks, things started to feel off. Little details stood out to me, things I couldn't quite ignore. She began coming home later than usual, often with a story about how a training session had gone long or how her gym buddy suggested staying longer to hit the sauna. Sure, I wasn't against her enjoying her gym time, but it was starting to feel like she was practically living there. Every other night, she'd be gone, and each time, she'd stay out just a little later than before. When I brought it up, she brushed it off with a casual, "Don't worry so much." But I couldn't shake the feeling that her dedication seemed excessive for someone who had just started working out. Then came the shopping spree. One evening, she came home with bags full of new workout clothes, form-fitting leggings, brightly colored tops, even brand new sneakers. She joked about how her old college t-shirts weren't gym appropriate and that it was all an investment in her health. I nodded along, trying to be supportive, but something about it felt out of place. It wasn't like her to dive into something so enthusiastically unless it was work. After each gym session, she'd come home exhausted but glowing, eager to tell me about some new exercise she'd mastered or how much weight she'd lost. Her excitement was infectious, and I wanted to share it with her, but there was this nagging feeling in the back of my mind, a sense that I was missing something. Then there was the phone. In the evenings, she'd sit beside me on the couch, scrolling through her messages more than usual. At first, it seemed harmless enough. She'd mention tips from gym friends or talk about a class that sounded amazing. But as time went on, her phone became almost an extension of her hand. She'd laugh at inside jokes I wasn't privy to and check her messages at odd hours. When I asked, she waved it off, saying it was just her gym buddy texting about workouts. But the frequency, the urgency, it was enough to gnaw at me. Her face would light up when she talked about her gym friends, more than I'd seen it do for anything else in years. I started questioning myself. Was I just being paranoid? Maybe I wasn't used to seeing her so full of life. I wanted to be happy for her, I really did. But as the weeks passed, I found myself checking the clock when she got home, doing the math in my head to figure out how long a gym session really took. When she added a nightly protein shake to her routine, blending fruit and powders with this newfound intensity, my unease deepened. She'd talk about getting serious about fitness, throwing out health slogans that sounded like they were lifted straight from a magazine. I played along, even tasting the shakes when she offered. But inside, the quiet voice of doubt was growing louder. The signs started small, barely noticeable at first. One evening, I came home to find faint, damp footprints by the front door. It struck me as odd because she's the type to take her shoes off at the door. I brushed it off as her tracking something in after the gym, but the detail stuck in my mind. The next day, I noticed those same faint marks again. It made my stomach tighten in a way I couldn't explain. Then there was the bed. We've always had a routine. Fresh sheets every Sunday, no exceptions. But that Thursday, I walked into our bedroom and saw the bed made with freshly washed linens. I knew we'd just changed them a few days earlier. The crisp corners, the lingering scent of fabric softener. It all felt out of place. I considered asking her about it but held back. I didn't want to come across as obsessing over something as minor as bedsheets. Still, that uneasy feeling grew stronger, creeping into my thoughts more often than I cared to admit. Other little things started popping up. A throw pillow missing from the couch one evening, only to reappear the next day. Small household details that felt subtly wrong. Each time I convinced myself I was imagining things, overanalyzing the ordinary. But the more I tried to shake it off, the harder it became to ignore. Then one afternoon, I noticed her hairbrush on the bathroom counter. There were a few short, dark hairs caught in the bristles. Not unusual except for the fact that her hair is light brown. Those dark strands didn't belong to her. My mind raced, searching for a logical explanation. Maybe she'd lent the brush to someone, but that wasn't like her. As I stood there staring at the hairbrush, a sinking feeling settled in my chest. My thoughts spiraled, and no matter how hard I tried to rationalize it, I couldn't silence that inner voice telling me something was wrong. I left the brush exactly where I'd found it, trying to shake off the heavy unease clinging to me. As these details began to pile up, I couldn't ignore the tension building in my chest. It felt like I was becoming a stranger in my own home, my mind constantly analyzing every little thing, searching for patterns where maybe there were none. Each night I'd lie beside her in bed, the weight of my doubts pressing down on me. I wondered if she noticed the same strange things I did, but if she did, she never let on. She stayed calm, acting as if everything was perfectly normal while I silently wrestled with the questions in my head. Instead of confronting her, I pushed my suspicions down deep, convincing myself to wait and observe. I told myself I wasn't going to jump to conclusions, not without proof. But every odd, seemingly minor detail kept reinforcing a nagging sense of unease, something I couldn't yet put into words. I told myself I'd wait, even though the waiting was agony. Part of me wondered if I'd ever get the answers I was looking for, or if I even wanted them. Then, on an otherwise typical Tuesday evening, I stumbled upon something that shook me to my core. Her phone was left on the kitchen table, its screen dim but unlocked. She had just gone into the shower, humming to herself, completely unaware that she'd forgotten it there. Normally, she was meticulous about keeping her phone close, never leaving it unattended. It felt like a slip, almost like an unspoken invitation. My rational mind screamed at me not to do it, not to cross that line. But after the past few weeks of unanswered questions and unsettling changes, my resolve wavered. I justified it to myself, telling myself I was just looking to put my fears to rest, to prove that I was overthinking everything. But the moment I picked up the phone, a surge of adrenaline coursed through me. My hands trembled as I scrolled through her recent messages, my heart pounding in my chest. Most of the chats were mundane, messages with friends and coworkers, nothing out of the ordinary. But then I saw a pinned conversation with someone named John, a name she'd never mentioned before. A knot formed in my stomach as I opened the thread, a mix of dread and determination washing over me. As I scrolled through their messages, my pulse quickened. At first glance, the tone seemed casual, lighthearted even, jokes about workouts and words of encouragement. But as I read further, the subtext became impossible to ignore. There was a level of intimacy in their conversation that didn't belong. Then I saw it, a message from him calling her his beautiful distraction. My breath caught as my eyes darted to her response, a playful, flirty emoji. She didn't deny it, didn't even try to set a boundary. My throat went dry as the truth began to crystallize. This wasn't just friendly banter. There was something deeper here, something she'd been hiding. I kept scrolling, my hands clammy and my heart racing. Their messages hinted at plans to meet up after workouts, dinners they'd shared, and quiet, private moments I hadn't been privy to. A white-hot rage bubbled up inside me, sharp, almost overwhelming. This was my wife, my partner, sharing her time, her secrets, her smiles with another man. Each laughing emoji, each affectionate reply was like a dagger to the heart. She was so engaged, so invested, as though this connection with him had become her priority. But even in my fury, I stopped myself from doing anything rash. My first instinct was to storm into the bathroom, shove the phone in her face, and demand answers. But something held me back, a cold, calculating need to understand the depth of this betrayal. Was this just a harmless flirtation, something that would eventually fizzle out? Or had she crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed? I had to know the truth before I confronted her. Setting the phone down, my anger simmered into a quiet, icy determination. If I was going to address this, I needed more than a few suggestive texts. I needed clarity. As much as it hurt, I decided to wait, to keep my suspicions hidden. That night, as I lay in bed beside her, my mind replayed every word I'd read. I glanced at her, sleeping peacefully, her breathing slow and steady, as though she hadn't a single care in the world. She had no idea that I knew. No idea that I'd seen the cracks in the facade she'd so carefully constructed. And as I stared at the ceiling, the weight of it all pressing down on me, I made a silent vow. I wasn't going to let her get away with this. Not without the whole truth. Not without answers. My mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, strategies to confront her, or maybe to just let things unravel further. Rachel could go on pretending, sneaking around with John, but eventually she'd have to face reality. And by then, I'd be ready. The idea hit me one evening while I was sitting alone, replaying those messages between her and John over and over again. Doubt and anger churned inside me, the images from her conversations haunting me like ghosts I couldn't shake. If I confronted her now, she'd likely deny everything, twist the story, and somehow make me feel like I was the one in the wrong. I needed undeniable proof, something she couldn't wriggle out of. And that's when it hit me, a hidden camera. The thought felt extreme at first, but after everything I'd uncovered, extreme measures didn't seem all that unreasonable anymore. If I was going to get to the bottom of this, I needed to see what was really happening in my own home when I wasn't around. The very next day, I made a detour on my way back from work, stopping at a gadget store, one of those places I'd never had a reason to step into before. I browsed through shelves filled with devices I never imagined I'd need until my eyes landed on a small, discreet camera. It was tiny, no bigger than a pen cap, and could blend into any space unnoticed. A wave of mixed emotions hit me as I paid for it. Guilt for crossing a line, for stepping into this shadowy world of surveillance. But that guilt was drowned out by a steely determination. She was the one who had broken the trust, who had forced my hand. I wasn't doing this because I wanted to. I was doing it because I had to. Back home, I spent a good while studying every corner of our bedroom, searching for the perfect hiding spot. It had to be subtle, somewhere she'd never looked twice. My eyes landed on the bookshelf in the corner, just above eye level. It was perfect. Nestled behind the edge of an old photo frame, it would be completely out of sight. As I set up the camera, it felt surreal, like I was watching someone else, some version of myself I barely recognized. Going through these clandestine motions. With a steady hand, I adjusted the angle until I was certain it covered the entire room. Then I stepped back, surveying our bedroom with fresh eyes. It looked the same as it always had, yet now it carried a weight, a secret. That once familiar space was now a stage, every object in it a potential prop in the unfolding drama. A chill ran through me as I realized what I was doing. For a brief moment, doubt crept in. Was I taking this too far? But I quickly shoved the thought aside. If there was nothing to hide, she'd never need to know. And if there was, well then, I'd finally have what I needed. In the days that followed, I made it a routine to check the footage when I was alone. Most days there was nothing. Just her coming home, going about her usual routine. But the anticipation gnawed at me, growing stronger with every uneventful evening. Watching those files became an obsession. Every night I'd sit in the dark, scrolling through hours of footage, waiting for something, anything that would confirm my worst fears. The first time I saw them together on the camera, it felt like the air had been punched out of me. There they were, Rachel and John, entering our bedroom as if it were theirs. She moved around with ease, laughing, a light, carefree sound I hadn't heard from her in ages, a sound she clearly reserved for him. Watching them in my space, standing there like they owned it, something inside me snapped. Any lingering doubt was obliterated. This was it, the cold, hard evidence I had been waiting for. At first, they seemed awkward. John perched on the edge of the bed, looking hesitant, while she hovered close, trying to coax him along with soft touches and whispered reassurances. It was grotesque, watching this stranger occupy my place, leaning into the woman I'd trusted for years. But what struck me was his unease. He was visibly uncomfortable, shifting in place and avoiding her gaze. Rachel, on the other hand, was growing visibly frustrated. Her tone sharpened, her gestures became more insistent. It was almost laughable in a bitter way, like watching a poorly rehearsed play. Then she said something that stopped me cold. Leaning in, she murmured something about, A little help if he needed it. Viagra, she called it. She even laughed like it was some private joke between them. My fists clenched involuntarily, the sheer audacity of it. She had planned for this. She had brought those pills into our home, kept them here, ready for him. Any line she could have respected, any boundary she could have honored, was long gone. As I watched, my anger hardened into something colder, more calculated. Rachel kept trying to reassure him, promising they'd get it right next time. Her words didn't sting anymore. They only fueled the plan forming in my mind, clear and methodical. If she thought she could outplay me, she was about to learn just how wrong she was. They thought they could use my home as their playground, sneaking around like I wouldn't notice. But they had no idea, none at all, that I was watching, waiting, planning. As I sat through the rest of that recording, my initial anger began to fade, replaced by something colder. It wasn't bitterness, and it wasn't despair. It was a calm, calculated resolve. For the first time, I felt the satisfaction of knowing I wasn't helpless anymore. This wasn't a knee-jerk reaction. It was a deliberate, measured move. They'd handed me the perfect weapon on a silver platter, and I was going to use it. If he needed help just to perform, well, I'd make damn sure he got more help than he ever bargained for. The trick was figuring out the right way to approach it. When the recording ended, I switched off the screen and sat there in the darkness for a long while. The silence wrapped around me, heavy but not stifling. Oddly, I didn't feel the kind of rage I had expected, not the blinding anger that burns and fizzles out. Instead, there was an eerie calmness, a certainty. She had made her choices, and now I was making mine. The only thing left was to see it through, down to the last detail. As I finally stood to leave the room, one thought resonated in my mind. The real game had only just begun. The idea didn't come to me all at once. It crept in slowly, piece by piece, as I replayed everything I'd seen and read over the past few days. I remembered skimming an article once, barely paying attention at the time, about certain medications that could cause permanent effects if misused. One detail stuck with me now, sharper than ever. A specific compound that, if taken regularly, could lead to irreversible impotence. The thought took root and began to grow. I wasn't looking to make a scene, to have some explosive confrontation that might let them wriggle out of accountability. No, I wanted something lasting, a consequence that would haunt him long after the thrill of sneaking around had faded. I started researching, methodically, carefully. I needed to understand every aspect of what I was dealing with. There was no room for mistakes. I dug into the compound's properties, how it worked, how it could be used without raising suspicion. Most importantly, I figured out how to obtain it without leaving a trail. The more I planned, the calmer I felt. It wasn't enough to catch them in the act. I wanted him to feel the weight of his choices for the rest of his life. Next, I tackled the practical side of the plan. I had to figure out how to mix the compound seamlessly with the pills he'd likely be taking soon, thanks to his little performance issues. A simple over-the-counter capsule wouldn't do. I needed the replacement to look exactly like those infamous little blue pills. Hours of online research followed, reading about pill molds, food-safe dyes, and the art of crafting something that looked entirely convincing. This wasn't a hasty, reckless act. It was precise, calculated, as clinical as it was personal. I could practically see the finished product in my mind, a line of pills indistinguishable from the real thing, with one devastating difference. When the supplies I'd ordered finally arrived, I worked in absolute silence. Alone in the house, I moved with steady hands, blending the compound into perfect proportions. Each pill was shaped and dyed with a precision that left no trace of tampering. By the time I was done, a grim sense of satisfaction washed over me. The power was finally back in my hands. No one would suspect a thing, not her, not him. They thought they were clever, sneaking around behind my back. But soon enough, he'd learn exactly how high the cost of their little game would be. All that remained now was to place the pills where he could find them. I knew she had them stashed somewhere in the house. She'd mentioned it to him, laughing about her little helpful stash. So I was certain they were waiting, hidden and ready for his next visit. There was something twistedly satisfying about the idea of her rummaging through her things to retrieve them, completely unaware that I had orchestrated every step. I was no longer just a bystander in their deceit. They thought they were running the show, but I was the one pulling the strings now. Every move they made would be under my control, every consequence carefully engineered by me. The rules of their game had changed, and they hadn't even realized it yet. The hunt for her betrayal's hiding place was a quiet, deliberate affair. I waited until she left for the gym, then moved methodically from room to room, my search precise and careful. I wasn't going to leave a trace of my presence. My first stops were the obvious places: her bathroom drawers, the bedside table, even the kitchen, though I doubted she'd stash something like that there. Each empty space only deepened my resolve, the cold certainty growing inside me. I would find it. It was only a matter of time. Finally, I made my way to her closet, a space I rarely, if ever, ventured into. Pushing aside her jackets and neatly hung skirts, I searched each shelf with calm focus. Then tucked behind a row of folded scarves, I spotted it. A small, dark bottle. It was half hidden but unmistakable. I didn't need to open it to know that I had found what I was looking for. For a moment, I just stood there, holding the bottle in my hand. It looked so ordinary, so inconsequential. Just a simple, unmarked container filled with small blue pills. But to me, it represented every lie she'd told, every secret message she'd sent, every ounce of trust she'd shattered. My grip tightened as the anger began to bubble up, but I forced myself to stay calm. This wasn't the time for emotion. This was the time for precision. I had a plan, and I was going to see it through. Carefully, I unscrewed the cap and stared at the pills inside. That familiar shade of blue mocked me, each one a silent reminder of the betrayal that had seeped into my home. I removed a few of the originals and replaced them with my own, each movement deliberate and controlled. I made sure the replacements blended seamlessly, identical in every way. When I was done, I twisted the cap back on, ensuring it was tight, and returned the bottle to its exact hiding spot. Stepping back, I took a final look at her closet, making sure everything was exactly as she'd left it. No sign of my intrusion, no evidence of what I'd just done. The pills now sat quietly behind her clothes, a weapon hidden in plain sight, waiting for their moment. I took a deep breath, feeling a grim satisfaction. She wouldn't suspect a thing, not until it was far too late. I left the room as silently as I'd entered and resumed my day like nothing had happened. My demeanor was steady, my routine unchanged. To her, I was the same predictable husband she'd grown used to underestimating. But inside, I was anything but predictable. I felt the weight of my plans settle into place, every piece of it perfectly aligned. Now the next move was hers, and I was ready to watch it unfold. Weeks passed, and the waiting paid off. It started subtly at first, just like every other time. She brought him into our bedroom, both of them acting as though they were invincible, as though their secret would remain buried forever. But this time, things played out differently. At first, he seemed eager, maybe even confident. Their usual playful flirting began, but it wasn't long before his confidence faltered. I watched the change on his face through the camera's cold, unblinking lens. His smirk gave way to unease, then frustration. He tried to brush it off, but it was obvious. He couldn't perform. Not this time. She laughed lightly, trying to ease the tension, but her amusement quickly turned awkward. She reassured him with soft words and gentle touches, saying it happens to everyone, urging him to relax. But her patience was wearing thin, and it showed. His discomfort grew, the irritation in his body language impossible to miss. He avoided her gaze, likely embarrassed, while she kept trying to soothe him, her frustration barely concealed. It was surreal watching their false confidence crumble in my own bedroom. The two of them had turned this sacred space into their playground, but now it was turning into a stage for their humiliation. I felt no pity, just satisfaction, a cold, grim satisfaction, as the pills did exactly what they were meant to do. With each new recording, it became increasingly clear that this wasn't a one-time issue. Every time he showed up, hope flickered briefly in his eyes, but their encounters played out the same way: awkward, fumbling failures. The frustration between them began to fester. The easy laughter and secretive smiles gave way to tension. He snapped at her, his annoyance poorly veiled. She tried to maintain her patience, offering reassurances and suggestions. But her words grew sharper as the chemistry they thought they had dissolved into hostility. The cracks in their affair were widening. Little barbs slipped into their conversations, veiled insults cloaked as jokes. Her attempts to salvage the mood were half-hearted at best, and his irritation only deepened. It was almost comical to watch, their fantasy unraveling, their once sly glances replaced by glares. They thought they were invincible, that they could carry on as though no one would ever find out. But now their carefully constructed illusion was collapsing under the weight of their frustration. And I was the silent observer, watching every second of their downfall from the shadows. I could see it, her strain, her desperation to keep things from falling apart. She clung to the hope that this was just temporary, another one of life's little hiccups. But she didn't understand. This wasn't a rough patch. It was a permanent problem. Her soft encouragement only seemed to worsen the situation, and his irritation grew with each failed attempt. What had once been their secret thrill had become a simmering source of tension neither could ignore. The irony was delicious. She didn't have the faintest clue about what was truly behind his struggles. Instead, she busied herself spinning excuses, stress, a bad day, fatigue, anything to explain away the issue. Her blindness to the truth only fueled my satisfaction. I watched as she unwittingly trapped him further, her misguided attempts to reassure him doing more harm than good. It was poetic, really. They were bound together by a problem neither could control, much less understand. Night after night, I sat in the quiet, watching them battle their invisible adversary. Each encounter showed me how deeply my plan was sinking its teeth into their lives. I didn't need to intervene. I didn't need to say a single word. All I had to do was wait and let their frustrations unravel them, piece by piece. Weeks turned into months, and the effects of my plan had taken root more deeply than even I anticipated. She tried to keep up appearances, but the cracks in their arrangement were impossible to ignore. Then one evening over dinner, she casually mentioned a story from the gym. She started lightheartedly, recounting how some of her friends had been whispering about John's sensitive issue. I kept my face neutral, letting her talk, though every word sharpened the edge of my satisfaction. She laughed, a little too hard, and said something about how he'd become the topic of gossip, especially after one of his ex-girlfriends spread rumors about him. Her attempt to brush it off was almost convincing, but I caught the flash of tension in her eyes. The gossip was clearly bothering her, even if she pretended otherwise. She rambled on, explaining how the whispers had started because John's ex had mentioned his problems were becoming noticeable. Just one of those things that gets around, she said, trying to sound dismissive. What she didn't know was that I'd been aware of his predicament for weeks. Hearing her recount the growing ripple of consequences felt like a quiet victory. It was validation that my patience and planning had paid off in ways I couldn't have scripted better. She mentioned almost offhandedly that John had started seeing doctors to figure out what was wrong. The detached tone she used, as if to distance herself from the problem, didn't escape me. Apparently, he'd been consulting multiple specialists, but none could find a cause. The issue remained unsolved, a frustrating mystery that no pill or therapy could fix. I could only imagine his growing desperation as he realized this wasn't a temporary setback. This was his new reality. It was quite literally irreversible. She went on about how he vented to her, describing his efforts. Doctor visits, experimental therapies, even dietary changes. Anything to reclaim what he'd lost. I nodded along, my expression carefully impassive, but inside I felt the icy satisfaction of knowing he was completely trapped. Meanwhile, she was trying to hold the crumbling pieces of their affair together. The stress was taking its toll, and the walls of their secret rendezvous were closing in. Each failed doctor's visit was like another nail in the coffin of their little fantasy. I could hear the frustration seeping into her voice as she talked, a mix of embarrassment and irritation bubbling beneath the surface. The whispers at the gym weren't helping. She tried to laugh off the rumors, but it was clear the gossip stung. The reality of their consequence-free affair was finally dawning on her. What had started as a thrilling escape was now a tangled mess, and her pride was taking a hit she hadn't anticipated. When she finished her story, I let her words linger. The silence between us was deliberate. She didn't know it, but every detail she'd shared was proof that my plan had unfolded perfectly. I gave her a casual nod and a reassuring smile, the picture of a supportive husband listening to his wife's harmless chatter. Deep down, I knew I had played this game to its conclusion. That evening, I sat quietly in the living room, the weight of my plan settling into place. Every detail had been accounted for, every step executed to perfection. Now the final piece was ready to fall into place. I'd waited for this moment for so long, the point where she would finally understand what she'd done and how meticulously I'd orchestrated her downfall. The stage was set, and I was prepared to deliver the truth, word by word, blow by blow. When I heard the key turn in the lock, I stayed seated, my face calm and almost expressionless. She entered with her usual energy, but the moment she saw me sitting there, waiting, something in her expression shifted. A hint of surprise, maybe even discomfort. I motioned for her to sit down across from me. She didn't speak but sensed the gravity of the moment and lowered herself onto the couch, still silent. For a few seconds, I just looked at her, letting the silence stretch between us. I watched the way her knees fidgeted, the way her eyes flickered nervously. Then with a steady voice, I told her I knew. I told her I'd known for months about her affair with John, about every lie she'd fed me, every night she spent thinking she was clever enough to hide it from me. Her face went pale, the weight of my words washing over her like a tide. She tried to interrupt, probably to deny it, but I raised a hand to silence her. I wasn't interested in her excuses anymore. This was my time to speak, to show her just how deeply she had underestimated me. I laid it all out, every step of her betrayal, every detail I had carefully observed, the hidden camera, the messages, the changes I'd noticed around the house. She squirmed in her seat, unable to meet my gaze, growing increasingly uncomfortable as I spoke. But the real blow came when I told her about the pills. I explained how I'd found her secret stash and swapped them out with something that would ensure John's performance issues would be permanent. The color drained from her face as the full weight of my words settled over her. I watched as shock and horror twisted in her expression. The realization hit her like a freight train. John's condition wasn't a mistake. It had been orchestrated with precision. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. She couldn't quite process what I had done. I told her I hadn't just exposed her affair. I had made sure there would be consequences. Her lover, the man she had risked everything for, would never be the same again. A man who had once been whole was now a shadow of himself, all because of her choices and mine. As she sat there speechless, the weight of her betrayal finally crashing down on her, I felt a cold, quiet satisfaction. She'd spent months trying to live a life full of secrets, thinking she could keep it all separate, but now she was seeing just how costly those secrets could be. I leaned back, watching her struggle to compose herself. Her hands trembled in her lap, twisting nervously. She finally spoke, asking why, as if she truly didn't understand how her actions had led to this moment. I didn't need to answer her. The facts spoke for themselves. She had made a choice when she brought John into our lives, and I had made mine when I decided to make them both pay. The difference was, she had assumed she was in control, but now, sitting across from me, she saw just how completely that control had shifted. The silence between us grew heavier, filled with everything she could no longer deny. There was no going back, no way to undo what she had done. The life she had built with him, the thrill of their secret, was nothing more than a broken illusion. Now she had given up everything for a man who was no longer whole, all because of her own actions and my careful planning. I didn't need to say anything more. She could see it now. Her choices had led her here, and now she had to face the consequences. Alone. There was no one else to blame. I stood up, turning to leave the room. I felt a sense of closure, a quiet finality to everything that had transpired. She remained on the couch, stunned, staring at nothing as the full weight of her betrayal crushed down on her. I left her there in silence, the memory of her shocked expression enough to assure me that from now on she would live with the reality she'd created. A reality in which her lover was forever changed, and she was left with the knowledge that I had seen and controlled it all. I sat back down, giving her a long, level look, letting her think that maybe the worst was over, that perhaps I would leave it at that. But this wasn't the end, not for her, and I wanted her to know just how complete her downfall would be. After a heavy pause, I spoke again, my voice steady, almost casual. "I'm filing for divorce," I told her. There was no question, no possibility of reconciliation. I watched her face as the words sank in. The shock quickly gave way to something darker, fear. She knew deep down that there would be no way to mend what she had broken. This was the price she would pay for the double life she'd worked so hard to maintain. Her expression crumbled as she started to plead, her voice shaky, desperate. She tried to convince me that this didn't have to be the end. I let her go on for a few moments, her words blending together in a tangle of excuses, remorse, and bargaining. It was almost pitiful seeing her realize the magnitude of what she had done only when it was too late. But I wasn't moved. Not by her tears, not by the desperation in her voice. I told her plainly that the time for apologies had long passed. Her pleas couldn't change the truth of what she had done, nor could they erase the disgust I felt when I looked at her now. I let her know the divorce wouldn't be the quiet, private affair she might have hoped for. I explained with the same calm precision I had used all along that I had everything documented, every piece of footage from the hidden camera, every recording that showed the betrayal she'd brought into our home. Her eyes widened as I laid it all out, step by step. I told her I intended to make sure her family and close friends knew exactly what she had done. I wanted them to see the truth, unfiltered. I knew they'd understand the depth of her deceit. Her carefully crafted facade would be shattered, stripped away, leaving only the cold reality of her betrayal. Her voice broke as she tried to protest, grasping at anything she thought might change my mind. She stumbled through excuses, begging me to reconsider, asking me to think of what people would say, how it would impact her life. I could see her mind racing, grasping for some way out, but there was none. The humiliation she felt was only a taste of what was coming, and for once, she had no control over the outcome. I reminded her that she had made her choices freely, without regard for the consequences. Now the truth would be as public as her deception had been private. I leaned forward, my voice dropping lower as I told her this was the final step in my plan, the culmination of every betrayal she thought she had kept hidden. Her family, her friends, all the people she held dear, would soon know exactly how she had thrown away her marriage for a thrill, how little respect she had for the life we had built. I could see the horror in her eyes as she realized the impact this would have, the way it would change how everyone in her life saw her. Her actions would be laid bare. No more secrets, no more lies to hide behind. Her pleas grew quieter, a desperate whisper, as she asked if there was any way to stop this. Any chance that I would relent. But I looked at her unflinchingly and told her there was nothing she could say that would make me change my mind. She had chosen to break our trust, and I had chosen to expose her for it. I had made my decision. She would have to live with it. There was a finality in my voice that seemed to drain the last of her resistance, leaving her silent, defeated. The reality of her situation fully sank in. I stood up, leaving her there in the silence. The weight of everything I'd said pressed down on her. The house felt colder, emptier as I looked at her one last time, knowing that whatever we had shared had ended long before this conversation. This was simply the final reckoning, the moment when all the lies came crashing down. I had no sympathy left to offer her. She would face the fallout on her own, left to pick up the pieces of a life she had chosen to destroy. As I walked away, leaving her alone with her guilt and shame, I felt a strange sense of closure, a calmness I hadn't felt in months. She could have her regrets, her excuses, but nothing would change the path she had set us on. I had delivered my final message. Now she would have to live with it, carrying the weight of her choices, a punishment far more lasting than any words I could have spoken.